When you send flowers to someone, you have sent a fragrant and beautiful gift. You've also sent the sexual parts of a plant. That's right, flowers are the reproductive organs of most plants. Flowers are not only pretty, but they're essential. All plants must reproduce themselves to continue their species, and flowers are only one part of the never-ending cycle of plant reproduction. From the delicate tropical hibiscus to the dry desert lands and the spiny cactus, all flowering plants have this basic life cycle. When conditions are right, a mature plant will blossom. The primary function of the blossom is to produce seeds. But first, the flower needs to be pollinated in order to develop a fruit and produce seeds. Insects often aid in the pollination. After the flower is pollinated and fertilized, an embryo develops as part of the seed. And it's the embryo inside the seed that will eventually become a new plant. The fruits will dry out and drop their seeds to the ground. Or the fruit may be eaten by animals that will later spread the seeds in their droppings. Here in time-lapse is the growth of a young cactus plant that has successfully sprouted from a seed.
And so the life cycle begins again. From the mature plant, a flower is produced. The flower is pollinated and fertilized. Then it develops into a fruit with seeds. The seeds are dispersed, and hopefully they grow into mature plants. To learn more about this cycle, let's begin with the most colorful part, the flowers. These are tulips. Like most flowers, they produce seeds. Tulips have both male and female reproductive parts. In the center is the light-colored female part, the pistil. The dark surrounding male parts are stamens. The stamens produce pollen. The pollen must get to the pistil before the flower develops seeds. That's pollination. Here in time-lapse, you can see the male stamens pollinating the female pistil. And here, the pollinated pistil. When the pollen from the stamen lands on the sticky pistil, the pollen grains send tubes down to the ovary, which contains the ovules. The pollen tubes carry male sperm cells into the ovules, and fertilization takes place. When fertilization is complete, the flower withers and dies, but the fruit continues to develop its seeds, each containing a tiny new plant.
Let's see another example of ovules in the pistil of this lily. Cutting it open helps us see the inside. There's the pollen, and the pollen produces tubes that grow down to the ovules and carry the male sperm cells that make fertilization possible. The fertilized ovules then develop into seeds. By the way, if a flower has both male and female parts, like the tulip in this lily, then it's called a perfect flower. The male stamen, the female pistil, a perfect flower. Here's another perfect flower, where both stamens and pistils are easily seen. But if you look at a daisy, you'll think we've made all this up, because you won't see any stamens or pistils. That's because some flowers are actually composed of many tiny separate flowers. For example, each of these white petals is a separate flower. There's the seed-producing part of that flower. And this fluffy area around the center is also composed of seed-producing flowers. Thus, a single daisy is composed of many perfect flowers.
Another example is the dandelion. It's also a cluster of flowers. There's a dandelion, and on the right, 2 of its tiny flowers. The structure with the forked top is the pistil, and pressed against it are the stamens. Down at the base of this tiny flower is the ovary. So with male and female parts, the dandelion is perfect. If it didn't have both sexes in each flower, it would be an imperfect flower. The common garden squash is a great example of an imperfect flower. Each plant has 2 kinds of flowers, one male, the other female. There's the male flower with pollen on its stamens. With a few petals removed, we can see the stamen's pollen on the right. This must reach the pistil of the female flower on the left. Here's how they normally look. The squash plant must rely on bees to carry pollen from the male flower to the pistil of the female flower. Corn is another imperfect plant. The tassels, which are the male flowers, are at the top. And below, the corn silk is part of the female flower. The silk enters each ear of corn. Corn silks are actually long, thin pistils. Each pistil leads the pollen tube into an ovule. When fertilized, the ovules become kernels of corn, more familiar to you as corn on the cob. Sometimes the imperfect male and female flowers are in completely separate plants, like the poplar trees. This male flower is found only on the male poplar tree. The blossom is imperfect because it produces flowers with stamens, but no pistils. Other poplar trees will produce blossoms with pistils, but no stamens. Only these female flowers will produce seeds. So each imperfect flower is from a separate tree. The female is pollinated like this. Pollen is carried by the wind from the stamens of the male poplar blossom to the pistils of the female blossom on a separate tree. The result is pollination, then eventually seed production.
We should mention here that not all plants that produce seeds have flowers. The ones that do have flowers are called angiosperms.
The ones that have cones instead of flowers are called gymnosperms. But other than that difference, their life cycles are really quite similar. Let's take a look at the life cycle of a gymnosperm, such as a pine.
The mature pine tree grows both male and female cones instead of flowers. The male cones produce pollen for the female cones. Cones, of course, do not have all the pollen found in a flower. The male cones don't have stamens, and the female cones don't have pistils. But the essentials are still present. The female cones do have ovules. And the male cones do produce pollen, which enters the female cone. When the ovule is pollinated and fertilized, the inside seed will look like this. The pine seed embryo may develop for 2 years before the seed is fully mature. Here we see the embryo, the protective seed coat, and the stored food that is used when it sprouts. By time lapse, you can see the seed cone opening during the fall of the 2nd year. That opening will expose the seeds. Many of the seeds fall out and are blown away, but some may stay lodged in the cone for several years. These seeds may not grow right away. If the conditions are right, they will grow the following spring. Here you see the young seed leaves with the seed coat still on the tips. The coat falls and the young pine is on its way.
There are a few plants that don't produce seeds, like this fern, but they're more primitive than seed plants, so we won't discuss them now. The plants that do produce seeds depend on pollen, so let's take a closer look at pollen. These are pollen grains from various plants seen with an electron microscope. Each plant species has its own specific pollen. There are several ways for pollen to travel from one plant to another. The wind carries it for many plants, including some very important food plants like the wheat, with its pollen produced up here. And corn with its pollen on the top of the stalk where it will easily catch the wind. Gymnosperms are especially dependent upon the wind to carry pollen from the male cone to the female cone. Most colorful flowers attract insect pollinators. And larger animals, including bats and birds. Bees are specialists at pollination. They collect pollen and flower nectar as food. The bee's body is well adapted for carrying large amounts of pollen. On the hind legs are pollen baskets in which the pollen is stored. The many bristles on the hind legs help support the grains of pollen. This is the pistil of an iris flower. As the bee enters the iris for nectar, the pistil curls down and picks up pollen from the bee's back. As the bee crawls out, it brushes against the stamens, located here. So the bee now has new pollen placed on its back, which it can carry to another iris flower. There it gets more pollen, deposits it at another flower, and gets some more.
are vetch flowers. Like the iris, they are highly specialized for pollination by insects, especially bees. The bee lands on the lowermost petals, and its weight forces the pollen-covered stamen upward, like this. Bees usually visit one variety of flower a day, so they carry just one type of pollen. This is helpful to the flowers since they can only be pollinated by their own type of pollen. The meadow sage flower has a different method. Watch the lever action of its stamen. Notice the yellow pollen on the bee's back. And here's the dandelion again. That bee certainly has overloaded pollen baskets. The microscopic grains of pollen adhere to the pistils, which may have hook-like hairs. Or they may have a sticky surface that holds the pollen. When the pollen reaches the surface of a pistil, each pollen grain grows a tube, as seen here in time-lapse photography. The pollen tube will transport the sperm down to the egg. When the sperm reaches the ovule, fertilization takes place, and the ovule develops into a seed.
So when the pollen reaches a pistil, that's pollination. Then each grain grows a tube to a single ovule. The sperm cells travel through the tube to the ovule. There the cells combine. That's fertilization. Each fertilized ovule is a seed. First pollination, then fertilization. They're really two separate steps. Both angiosperms, the flowering plants, and gymnosperms, the cone-bearing plants, have pollen tubes. In the cone-bearing plants, only the female cones have ovules. The ovule has two egg cells. A wind-blown pollen grain will attach to the ovule. Then the pollen will develop a pollen tube. The sperm cells will travel through the tube, then fertilize the eggs. When the ovules develop into mature seeds, the cone opens and the seeds are released. So you can see that all those cones and flowers follow the same cycle: pollination, then fertilization, and seed production. Next, the seeds must get away from the parent plant so the new plant will have room to grow in good soil with sufficient water and sunlight.
Seeds have some interesting ways of getting to new locations. They're usually surrounded by the fruit, and that's because the fruit also develops from the flower. This portion that we've colored red here becomes the fruit, and in some plants so do parts of the yellow. This fertilized portion in blue here becomes the seed.
On this apple, all that's left of the flower is this dried portion here in the center. But inside, we find the seeds. Now the tomato is also a fruit because it too is from a flower, and inside there are seeds. As a matter of fact, all of these here are fruits. We recognize the obvious, like the melons, the pear, but some of the less obvious are avocado, cucumber, green pepper, peas, and even each kernel of corn here is a fruit, and inside is a seed. Now another less obvious one is the hard outer covering here of the nut. That's a fruit, and the part we eat is the seed. Now in all fruits, the main function is to help to disperse the seeds, but only some fruits are edible. The animals will eat the ones that are edible and transport those seeds away from the parent plant.
In those cases, whole seeds can pass unharmed through the digestive tract of an animal. Sometimes the fruits can glide with the wind. So the winged fruits of this angiosperm, the maple, can carry its seeds far away from the parent tree. Gymnosperms also rely upon the wind for seed dispersal. Their seeds have one wing that helps them fall from the cone, but it doesn't carry them very far from the parent tree. Some angiosperm seeds with plumes can travel for miles. The milkweed's plume acts as a parachute. Sometimes the whole plant will be uprooted by the wind and scatter the seeds as it goes. The tumbleweed seeds ripen at different times, so the tumbleweed may disperse its seeds for several weeks over many miles. Some fruits, like this hickory nut, are too heavy to be moved by the wind. So if the tree grows on a hillside, gravity may help the fruit roll to a new location, or it might float away. One of the best water-traveling fruits is the coconut. Its fruits fall from palms near the water to begin a journey that may take them thousands of miles to a final landing place.
This burdock fruit also relies on animals for dispersal. These hooks attach to passing animals. Long-haired animals are especially liable to pick up burrs and carry them to new locations. Some fruits don't need wind or animals to disperse their seeds. This touch-me-not plant can shoot its seeds far away, even without a human pinching them. The seeds land several feet away from the parent plant. This witch hazel plant also shoots its seeds. Here's a time-lapse shot of the fruits opening and pinching the seeds until they pop out and land several yards away. This fruit may hook onto a passing animal and then dig its way into the soil when it lands. The time-lapse photography shows how it coils when dry and uncoils in moisture. So repeated changes in moisture help it dig into the soil. The bristles at the drill-like tip help to keep it in the ground once it's started.
Humans also disperse seeds. Many food plants, like this corn, would lose the struggle for survival and become extinct if humans didn't cultivate them. Most of your food supply depends upon seed dispersal by humans. All seeds must be dispersed to ensure the survival of their species. Most seeds are produced in summer and autumn, yet millions of seeds can be stored or will lie on or in the earth without immediately sprouting. This waiting period is called dormancy. The seeds might remain dormant for weeks, months, or years after they've matured, even though they have a living embryo inside them. Here again is a living embryo of a pine seed. The food within the seed is used by the embryo at germination or sprouting. For these dormant pea seeds to germinate, they must first absorb large amounts of water. During this time lapse of a 24-hour period, you can see the seed coat soften and expand. Water is the most important factor in germination, but the temperature and oxygen level must be right too.
Here's a germinating bean seed. The root develops first, then the stem. The stem pulls the two seed leaves from the earth. The two seed leaves nourish the plant during its early growth until the true leaves can provide nourishment. Now the true leaves, seen on the top, can take carbon dioxide from the air, and the roots can provide minerals and water from the soil. So the exhausted seed leaves wither and drop from the plant. If the young plant survives to full maturity, then it too will produce flowers. And they'll need to be pollinated so fertilization can occur. The fertilized ovules will develop into seeds, and the seeds will need to be dispersed. And successful germination is the last step in plant reproduction. When a seed germinates and grows into a mature plant, the life cycle will again begin.